Welcome to our course on CSS Floats. So these are cascading style sheets and using floats for really rapid, quick web page and web layout developments. So floats are super powerful, and I'm going to show you how to build out your web page layout, 2-column websites, 3-column websites, and as many columns as you want within your web pages. My name is Lawrence, and I'm so excited to be your instructor for this course. I've been building web applications since 1999, and using floats within the web applications and web design process is something I do for almost every web page I design. So floats are very commonly used. So this is an example of the 2-column website that we're going to be developing within this course. And really it's just going to start out with a bunch of different divs, and I'm going to show you how to move those divs around and position different side menus and content areas, and how you can do this and create this really super quickly. Another one that we're going to be building out is a 3-column site, and you're going to be amazed at how easy it is. We're also going to be answering that ever important question about how we can align our column heights. So this has always been a challenge for web developers if we've got a side menu and our content is not in line with our content, our larger set of content, and I'm going to show you how you can do a quick fix for that so you can get these background colors of the columns going all the way down. So essentially the websites that we're going to be designing, we're going to be looking at floats and how they work. So basically how we can move elements to the left and to the right of content, and then we're going to be looking at building out a 2-column website like this where we can place the first menu column on the left or on the right, and how easily we can move those back and forth, and then have different content areas. So in this particular example we've got 3 content sections, but it could just as easily be 1 content section, and so on. I'm also going to show you how to build a 3-column website. So this particular one, we've got 3 columns, equal height or equal width, and again it's aligning all the way down. Same with this one here. So this one is about 40% for the menu, and then 60% for the main content area. And again, you're going to be really amazed at how easy it is to build out these quick web layouts using floats and CSS floats. Welcome to our course on CSS Floats. Now, CSS Floats allow us to create templates really easily using just CSS and updating the actual normal flow of how our divs or how our output would be displayed within our document. So first of all, I want to go through in this lesson some of the resources that I'm going to be using within this course. So let's open up our editor, and our editor that we're going to be using within this course is Brackets. So that's available at Brackets.io. So this is an Adobe product. It's free to download, works across multiple platforms. So whether you've got Windows or a Mac, you can download the latest version of Brackets over at Brackets.io. Now, of course, if you already have an editor that you're comfortable with using, then you can go ahead and stick with that one. This is just a suggestion, and we will also be using it within this course. Another resource that we're going to be using within this course is placeholder.com. So this is a website that actually allows us to get customized images and use them as placeholder images within our code. So this is going to be a really great resource because it saves us the trouble of actually getting images on our computer and then having to add them into our application. So we can just simply specify our width and our height of the image that we want, and it'll pull that image in. So this is a really great resource for images. And then lastly, we're just going to be linking to our file on the computer. So it's in the folder CSS/index. So this is where we're going to be accessing that file and utilizing and building out our example code using our editor and outputting it within the Chrome browser. So in the next lesson, we're going to jump right in and we're going to start coding, create some HTML, and then float those HTML elements using float property in CSS. Welcome to working with floats, and with floats we can actually move elements to the left or the right hand side, and this is commonly used when you're building out your web page layout. So first of all, let's create a class here of box1, and then I'm going to do another one of box2, and we'll set some heights and widths for the different boxes, and I'm just going to do it on page here. So box1, and copy that out, and we'll do box 2. And we need to have some dimensions for this in order to be able to see it. So we'll do a height of 100 pixels, a width of 100 pixels, and we'll do a background color of red. And I'm going to just copy this over for this one here, and let's set a background color of blue for this one. So basically we've got our two boxes here, and we can force that content to be, so even if we have a paragraph and we have some text in there, we can see that this one aligns. But what happens if we actually want to push the red box and we want it sitting here, or we want the red box to be on the right hand side and the blue box to be on the left hand side? So let's do that right now. So I'm going to move the red box over, and this is where floats come in. So if I want to float it over to the right hand side, I can save it, and we see that the CSS keeps it still in line, so everything still falls on that one line. But this is treated as one block now, and this particular block of content now has this content pushed over to the right hand side. And we can do the same thing for the left hand side, where we can float it over to the left. And that would essentially be forcing that content over to the left hand side. And of course we would need to have some text there, and basically so that would force it to the left of the text. We can also force it over to the right hand side, and really the order doesn't really matter as you're presenting it. So we could just as easily, even though box 1 is first, we can present it left, we can present it right, and we can push it over to wherever we want it to fall, and then we see the rest of the content that simply falls in line with that. So it's similar to when we're using our display and then we're positioning the content, but it's still keeping everything else in line with it. And a lot of times when you're using these floats, you see that there's not a lot of space between where the text ends. There's actually no space, and this is where a lot of times you need to use padding in order to create a little bit of a buffer between that text and between the content, or it actually should be margin here in this case, because we already have a background color of red. So the margin actually is going to create that spacing between the text and our element here, so our red box. And we could do the same thing for the blue box, and as we move them around, it's really is important to kind of keep an eye on that and make sure that we're not the margins together. And this is also commonly used when we're creating images. So essentially that's floating left and right, and this is the two options we have. We can also float to the left, and basically what that will mean is that they both line in to each other. So going through the source code, we can see that first we hit that red box, and then we have some text here, blah blah blah, and then we hit the blue box, which is also pushed over to the left, so the next available left spot. So notice that it's not actually pushing it underneath here to the left, but it's still keeping it within line here. So this is really another interesting feature of floats, is that it's not pushing it to the next line of block space, it's keeping that in line. So you see once we select that element, it's only relative to that particular element, and as it gets moved within that wrapped text around it. So unlike other CSS properties, this still keeps it within the normal flow of the content, and we can see that in this example that the normal flow of the content is still kept in place using floats. Welcome back, and we're going to be talking about floats in CSS. in the upcoming lessons. Now, a float basically allows you to take an element out of its normal flow and readjust it, either pull it to the left or to the right within the content, within its surrounding content. So let's first take a look at an image in a bunch of content. So let's add in some basic content here. I'm going to grab some lorem ipsum text. I'm going to go over to a website, loremipsum.net, and we just can go over to the API, and they have a really good API here that can actually generate lorem ipsum text. So we've got a bunch of text here. You can copy and paste it and update and add different HTML as well. So really useful resource when you want to just have some quick content added into your web page. So basically now when I go out to the web page, it's going to look like this. We've got some content in there, and now we need to add in an image. So let's say we want to add in an image. We've got quite a bit of text there, and we're going to go over to placehold it, and we're going to grab the source code for an image. Now the way that this works is it gives you a basic default image here, and it spaces it out or dimensions it depending on what your URL is. So if our source is 350 by 150, we're going to get an image with that same size. So if within this text I have this image, and now when we go out and we see that this image now has been set within this value here, but it doesn't really flow. It doesn't look really nice within the text, and this blue box around it is just showing us that this is the active element. So whatever we set here within brackets on the left hand side, it's just going to box around that blue, showing us the active element. Because I'm using actually brackets, and they have a live view. So what you do to get live view is there's this kind of little lightning bolt here in the mini menu, or you can go under File and you can do Live Preview, or on a Windows machine, Control Alt P, and that will output that live preview there. And then when I select whatever element I'm selecting, it's going to get that blue box around it. So that's what's happening there. But as we can see, we get this image, and it doesn't really look like it flows well with the text. So the really easy fix to that is to add in a flow. And again, what flows do is floats, they actually give you the ability to position that content outside, so you can shift it either left or right outside the normal flow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this one a class, and the class that I'm going to apply to it is just going to be my IMG. And then any images that I want to have that class, I can just specify within here. So what I want to do is I want my images to be more in line with the text. So whether I want to float it over to the left hand side, so floated left, we see that we get the image, we get the text wraps nicely around it. We can float it over to the right hand side, and we see that we get this nice positioning of that image, and it just nice and neatly fits into there. And a lot of times when you're creating images, you would create either some padding or a margin around it. So let's do 10 pix padding around it. So again, remember, padding is on the inside, margins on the outside. So you can do this type of effect where you've got some spacing between your text and your image. You've got this little buffer area. You can also do a nice border if you wanted to as well. So sometimes you'll find that you've got these borders around images, and then we can add an additional layer of a margin or something like that. And a lot of times the color is very light. So I'm going to do margin as well. So that basically means that whenever we have an image, so if I had several other images scattered within the different cells, we can see that they all nicely align like this, and we see that we get all of those images nicely positioned, and even if they're different size images, they're still going to position really nicely within the flow of our web page. And the only thing that is really happening here is that some of our images, so some of them are a little bit large, and when they're running over, they're overlapping the other images. So this is something to kind of work through with your text, just to make sure that it is outputting the way you want it to output. And really, this is really really it for images. And of course, if you wanted some more over to the left-hand side, again, depending on the size of your images and so on, then you can make the appropriate adjustments. Another thing I usually like to have with my images, so when we resize it like this, with images, I like to usually set a max width of 100%. So basically that just means that the image will always be at max 100%. So we get a much better resizing of the image content as we shrink the screen down. So it's always at max 100%. And because we've added in this margin, so maybe we want to do at max, or we need to probably place another element around there, so another div or a span, in order to give us that buffer, and then we could set that at whatever width we want to set it. So that's where we're getting that kind of overlap. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're using margins, that sometimes it's not the best effect, because you do get this overlap. So it is something to play around with in order to present the images as you want to present them within your web output. Welcome back, and in the previous lesson we showed you how you can float images. Now I'm going to take this one step further, and I'm going to update my images and create a span around it. So this span essentially is going to have a class for thumbnail. And then we'll close off that span after the end of the image. So now we've got an image with a class of thumbnail. So instead of having the CSS for the my image, I'm going to add in for the class thumbnail. And this is actually the one that I'm going to float right. I'm going to add in that extra margin and the padding and the border all into the thumbnail padding. So we'll refresh it. And initially, we'll just make that, clean that up a little bit, and I need to close off that span. That's why that one's not working. So we'll refresh it. So we've got our images once again. And we can see now when I resize it, so because we are using that max width 100%, it resizes a whole lot better. So this is just a quick update and tip to what we were looking at in the previous lesson, where we want to see that we can make our images responsive, and we could also float them, and then also have this nice kind of thumbnail border around that as well. So there's a lot of different ways to achieve this type of effect. So sometimes as well, you might want to do like a full border around the image as well. So you might want to do a border radius. So a lot of times you'll see thumbnails, they're rounded. So just to kind of update on the original border radius, let's set a border radius. We'll do 5 pixels of border radius. So to see that what happens now, it kind of rounds it. And I'm going to make this one a bit smaller as well, so it looks more like a thumbnail, where we've got this really light border around it. We've got some padding, we've got the border radius, and we can also add in a shadow around it if we want. So this is another thing that sometimes is added in within thumbnails just to make them look a little bit better. So we'll just do a box shadow. So box shadow will give it a basic shadow underlying. And for box shadow, we got to specify the position of the horizontal shadow, position of the vertical shadow, and then we've got some other options as well, so we can add in the spread of it. So let's do 10 pixels spread. So we see that right there's our shadow showing up, and maybe we'll do black. So now all of our images, or all of the thumbnail images, will have this box shadow. So this is just a quick way to create a nicer thumbnail. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this over into the other images that we had down here as well. And another thing, going back into floats, so sometimes you'll see that depending on the image, you might not want to float it always to the right, you might want to float it to the left, it might look better. So this is where a lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually pull out the float right, pull out the float left, and I'll just give them classes right and left. So instead of having to add that in there, I can just simply float left and float right. And I'll just clean that up again, save that, and we can see that now I can be more specific. And when I removed out those floats, it doesn't really look as nice anymore. So let's update our code, and we're going to add those back in. So maybe this one, I want it to float over to the right. I make it way smaller, refresh the page. So that one I want to make maybe to the right. The next one, maybe we're going to float this one to the left. And this one again maybe to the left. And again, you got to pay attention to what size your images are. So because this top one here, maybe we could make that one smaller, make that one smaller, or we could add in more text, of course, as well. And then lastly, this one, let's float this one back over to the right hand side. So this gives you more flexibility in your output of your images, and of course they're nicely styled with a nice border and format, and this can be really customized as you want as well. So sometimes you might not want the padding, you might just want the border, but most of the time you're doing padding around it. So we don't really always have margins. This is again depending on what you want within your content, but if you are adding that box shadow, then you do need to have a little bit of a buffer there so that that text isn't overlapped by the shadow. So that's how you can create thumbnails and then float those images within your content, pulling them either left or right, and positioning them properly within the content of your web page. Welcome back, and in the previous lesson we saw how useful floats were when we're actually working with images in line with our content, and we saw how nice and neatly we could position our image either to the left or to the right of our content. So in this lesson we're going to look at how we can use floats in order to do basic website designs. So first of all, let's go into our body section, and I'm going to create a series of divs. So the first one is just going to be a main container or a wrapper. So a lot of times you've got these wrappers to specify particular width of web page. So this is going to be our container, our first one. Next, let's create some divs, and I'm going to give it an ID. So each div that I have will have a different block ID. So we can have block 1, and the next one can be block 2. And let's say, for instance, maybe this is our header. And I'm also give it a class so that we can, I'll give it a class of divvy so that I can really easily add in some additional borders so we can see where the classes are and where they're showing up. So block 2, block 3, you got to give them all separate IDs, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I think that's good enough to create all of our web templates. So whether we're going to do like just a regular header, footer, header, content, footer, or if we're going to float them to the left or to the right to make multiple columns. So I'm going to show you how in the upcoming lessons. So next, what we would typically have is maybe a nav bar. So this would be our nav bar, and then this would be content, or maybe it's a main content, and this can be even more content. Sometimes this is a side menu, and then maybe even more content. And so these are all just content areas. So we've got content area 1, 2, and 3, and 4. So we'll just save that. So right now it doesn't really look like anything. So I do need to make some updates to the styling. So first of all, I'm going to set some styling for the container. And this is going to be, once again, this is that main container class for our HTML. It's going to hold all of our elements inside of it. And what this does is this gives us the ability to force a width. So if we wanted to all of our web pages to be at most 1080 pics, and we want to set a background to it. So set a background color, and maybe we want to have a background color to all of the content. So just refresh that. We see now that entire element is being forced, so we're getting a width of the 1080 for the container, and all of these are sitting inside of our container. If I go to inspect it, we see that our main container is holding that class and having that size. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. So there is an issue there with the color. So let's take a look at our source code. And I forgot the hash there. So now we've got that hash in there. So we see that this is the container area. So really what happens is if I get really big there, it's not centered. So in order to center it, this is where we would add in margin. And to center any element, you can do margin of 0 and then an auto for the left and right. And what happens now is that this element is now going to get centered. So see, it's being centered like that. So this is typically done for containers so that they float or they end up in the center of your content. And now what we're going to do is we're going to set up for the divs. So for divvy, so that I can see all of the different divs that I have below, let's give them a border. So I'm going to give it a 1-pick dashed border, and let's make it, well, that's probably not a good color because that's what our background is. So let's pick something else. So refresh it. So now we've got all of our divs there, and let's make them a little bit higher too. So we'll give it a default height of 200 pixels. So basically, so what we've set up is a basic template that we can work with, and now we can start structuring these a little bit better. I want to make the nav bar smaller in height. So we know that if we place our style properties after another one, it's just going to simply overwrite that. So if I want that particular one to be maybe 70 pixels, and I'm going to give another background color so that it stands out from the rest of the content, and maybe we can do black, and we'll do a font color of Alice Blue. So let's refresh that. So there's our navigation bar. So now what we can do is I'll show you how to start creating. So essentially, if we wanted a 1-column website, that's all there really is to do. We don't have to worry about floats if we've got 1 column, but what if we want to have a 2-column website? So we want this content on the left-hand side, and we want maybe all of these containers on the right, or maybe we want 3 content pieces and this 4th one to float over to the right-hand side. So let me show you how to do that in the upcoming lesson. Welcome back, and in this lesson we are going to create, or we're going to recreate our page content to be a 2-page website. So we said that we've got our header here, our nav bar, so these are all 100% blocks. We don't have to worry about these elements, but we want to take this content, so we want to have the 3 rows of content, and then the 4th one, let's add that in on the side. So we'll put that on the side. I'm going to make it smaller so we can see all of our structure, our entire layout within this one page. So just shrank it down, smaller percentage. So that's 50% of regular size. So let's add in our floats. So in this case, let's add in a div here, and I'm going to give it a class. And I'm going to float this one to the left. So I'm going to do kind of what we looked at earlier, where I'm going to float it to the left, or maybe this can be, instead of left, let's call this main, and then this one, let's call this one, let's create another div here, and we'll call this one side menu. And then close that one off. So we only have the one div that's going to be contained within there, and indent those. So when we refresh it, nothing has changed, because again, divs, they're just take up the entire block of code, but we don't really see anything different happening with those. So we've got the side menu, we've got the main menu, and now we need to add some additional structures. So let's bring these classes up into our CSS, and then we're going to add our CSS properties. So this one was side menu. So what we want to do is we want the side menu to be on the right hand side and have content 4, and then the main content within the main content area. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to decide how much or how wide our piece of content is going to be. So this is really important when it comes to floats, because as a div you have that entire 100% block. So if we wanted to do 60%, we could set the width of this one to be 60%, and you could use this fluid percentage widths, or you could use set pixel widths, again depending on what you're doing, how you're designing, and how you want your output to look. So now when I refresh it, we see that we get the 60% there and we get the 40% here, but we need to actually move content 4 up into this slot. And this is where floats come in. So what we can do is we can float this one over to the left hand side, and you'll see once we do that, it actually floats content 1, 2, 3 over to the left hand side, but content 4 is kind of a little bit messed up there. So we need to float this one, and since we're only doing the 2 columns, we're going to float one to the left and one to the right. And we see that now we've got content 1, 2, 3 and content 4, but our footer is actually still sitting down there. So that's not what we want, and this is where clearing of the floats is super important, because we want to make sure that we bring the footer back down to the bottom, and we see that the size of these doesn't really align well either, and it doesn't look right. So let's add that in, and this is one of those weird things with floats that you always have to keep in mind. Once you're floating certain elements, in order for the other elements to not float alongside those ones, you need to clear those floats. So we clear both. A lot of times you're going to see classes like clear or clear fix or something like that. So now within footer, once I add that clear fix, I refresh the page. We're actually setting that content up just as we would have wanted. We've got the footer at the bottom, we've got all these content areas, and then we've got content 4 at the right hand side. Welcome back, and in this lesson I'm going to show you a trick here if we want to have content 4. So if we want to have a specific color for content 4 going all the way down, because remember again, we still have that divvy class there that's specifying that our content 4 is only going to be 200 pixels. So now that I've removed that, basically if we've got some content in there and we want to make a color for sidebar, so if we wanted this one, for whatever reason, we wanted the background color to be red, and if I refresh it, we see that it only shows up on that little part there. So there is a trick there. There's also FlexBot, and there's quite a bit that you can do. You can set these as table columns using CSS, and there's a lot of solutions out there on the internet in order to get this color red going all the way down, even if you don't have content. The way that I usually like to do this, and the way that I usually like to handle this, is I add another container. So I'm going to give this container a class of background color, BG color, and I'm going to wrap around that entire main, around that sidebar. So now I've got another wrapper there, and I can update that wrapper. So BG color, and then this is the one where I would set the background color of red. And what we need to do as well is we need to specify under the background color. So if we want this to work, let's give it a height of 100%. And you're going to notice that nothing changes because it's still just a wrapper there, so there's no real content in there as of yet. And remember, we still have these floats happening. So this is another thing that you've got to keep in mind when you are creating this content, that you do need to be mindful of the clear fixes. And this is where I add in another clear fix. So just after the side menu here, I would add in a div, and I would give it a class of. So this one is our clear fix class, and then refresh it. So we see that everything goes red. So this is keeping in line with floats left and right. This is something to keep in mind, that until you've actually cleared the fix, then you're still floating left and right. So that's what was happening here, that we were still doing that float left and right from the sidebar and from the main. So that's why we added another div there to clear that out. And now we see that that red box goes all the way to the bottom. So that 100% is working. And if we remove that, just show you what happens there. So it's still taking up that full space because this is that whole container. And this is how we can align the site heights of those. So I know it's a little bit of a trick and a workaround, but this will work. And this is one way to set your column heights so that everything aligns and that your heights are in line. So even if you add in, if you don't have all of the content going right to the bottom, you can still have that sidebar color, and as you add in content, that sidebar will adjust accordingly. So if we were, for instance, to add in content, and instead of it being 200 pics, all of a sudden this content was 400, we see that our sidebar is still taking up all that available space. So this is what we can do as a fix in order to update our sidebar color, the background of our sidebar color, and work within that format. And another thing that I did want to add in before we finish this up is that we've got these floating to the left and to the right. So the interesting thing about this is that I can actually flip them around and flip them around in the order. So typically we're used to, as we read through the HTML code, whichever one we encounter first, we encounter sidebar, so we would typically expect that to be displayed first. But this is where the floats take place, that they actually allow you to push that content over. So it's actually still reading it out that the sidebar is first, but it knows to push that over to the right. So that's where it's ending up on the right, and then the next one is ending up on the left. So actually it doesn't matter, and you can really easily move your sidebar to the left or to the right, and you don't have to actually rearrange the order of your code. So that's another really cool thing with floats, also to keep in mind, that you do have the ability to kind of move them left or right and really do a quick redesign of how your content is being laid out. Just to make things more realistic, I also wanted to add in the navigation bar down here below, because I think that we're only going to keep this particular content as a navigation bar. So I'm going to just clean that one up, and I'm going to change it to nav bar, and then I'm going to add in some navigation bar, that styling for navigation bar. So I'm going to just copy and paste that in, so that our website is actually more realistic looking. So when we go and we refresh it, so we've got our navigation bar, we've got our content. So essentially this is our 2-column website ready to go, and then of course you can add in the content. If you don't want 3 areas of content, you can always remove out ones that you don't need. And of course we can readjust the header size, and typically you wouldn't be having all of these divs the same height, but this is just so that we do have some placeholder content and that we can see what the borders are. So maybe what we want to do is we want to maybe remove that out or set its own height and so on. So really easy to build out a really nice looking website using floating left and the right. So the next lesson, we're going to encounter a 3-column website, and you're going to be amazed at how easy it is to build that out with the floats as well. So that's coming up in the next lesson. Welcome back. In the previous lesson, we built a 2-column website, so now we're going to transform this into a 3-column website. So I'm going to use that same BG colored as the main container. I've got a side menu, I've got a main, but now I'm going to have actually 3 main blocks. So maybe what we can do is we'll get rid of these ones here. And now we've got the 3 content areas. So I can actually get rid of main as well, and I've got block 3, 4, and 5. Refresh the page, so I've got my 3 blocks of content there. I can get rid of this red as well, because we don't necessarily maybe want to have it red quite yet, or maybe we will. So just get rid of that, and now what I want to do is transform content 1, 2, and 3 into a 3-column website. And you're going to see how really easy this is to do with floats. So first of all, we're going to float our first one over to the left-hand side, And then we're going to float the other one over to the right hand side. So maybe we can just do column 1, column 2, so that we can differentiate all of these different elements. We could have used the IDs as well, but I think just using classes just makes more sense at the moment. So we'll just do column 1. And let's give this one a background color so we can distinguish between the three of them. And we're going to float this one over to the left hand side because this is going to be our first one. And remember again, the most important thing when you are floating is to specify a width. So this one is just going to be 3 columns, maybe all the columns are the same size. So the first column is going to be 33%. And then the next one is going to be column 2. So this one's going to also be 33%. And actually I should have left that background color, and maybe let's make this one red just to make it more interesting. And I got to add in the dot there for classes. So column 3. And so this one is going to be 33% as well, but this one's going to be floating over to the right hand side. And this is going to be a great illustration of what happens when you've got float to the left, float to the right, and you've got one here in the center. So remember, it's content 2 that's in the center. And we see that content 1 behaves properly, content 3 is behaving properly, but content 2 is not working quite right. So this is where we need to add something extra in here, so we can do a display. And I'm going to change this to inline block. And I'll show you what happens now. So once we transform it to an inline block, it actually moves itself into place. So I gotta just change that size. So we see that we do have the border around there as well. So we see that by changing it inline block, we're actually taking up that correct amount of space. And now typically this one is going to be actually taking the background color of everything. So if we wanted it to be red for whatever reason, the best course of action usually is to do it within this way. Because remember again, these borders are taking up a little bit of space. If I was to get rid of the border, then by all means we could go back to we could change this column 2 to be 34%, and then that should work because we want to always work on 100% across. So that way that works, and then of course we could add in padding as we want. So a lot of times when you do these types of columns, you want to have a little bit of padding, and the padding again is on the inside, it's not on the outside. But even when we add in that padding, we're still bumping it off, and we're still moving, getting out of our main alignment. So really it does sometimes take a little bit of time to play around with it just to make sure that everything is working out as expected and as planned. So adding in that padding, added in and updated the width. And because these columns, so just to explain better, it's the way that the divs are styled. So if we added in that padding, if we would need to typically have a container here that would have the 33%, and then we would have another one here that would have the class of divvy. So let's just update this because a lot of times these are common things that you'll see happening, and you do need to have these additional containers that are able to accommodate the calculations, because once we've got one inside of the other one, then some of our calculations get thrown off, and we can't put that value on that parent there. So we need to move those around and rework it and add another container there to hold that 33%. So let me just go back and do a quick explanation of what just happened and what I've just done. So we saw that we set a class for column 1, 2, and 3. So we gave the full calculations of 33%, 33%, and 34%, coming up with a total of 100%. But what happened over here is when I adjusted Divi and I gave it some padding, because we're still sitting on that same element, that padding also added in and calculated in, because this was an internal element, it also added that padding there as well, messing up our percentage calculations. And that's why I had to take that one out, that Divi out, and if I want my content to actually sit within a block that's a 33% parent or a 34% parent, then I've got to make sure that I create another container for that content. So that's all we had to do there, and it was as simple as that. And remember again that clear fix is there, so if we're not using those full colors, we can remove those out as well, or we could keep them in. So in this case, let's go down and add in some text into here. So going back up to here, so if I had a bunch of text here that I could pop into maybe one of these cells of content, and save that and clean it up a bit. So this was quite a lot of text that got added into one of those pieces of content. We see that we're actually running over, and we don't want to do that because these other ones aren't readjusting in height. So let's take a look at this, and we'll get a fix for that in the upcoming lesson. Welcome back, and this solution is going to be, again, a little bit tricky because there isn't really a good solution. Like these floating divs, they don't really like to inline as normally you'd expect a table that would take 100% of its sibling's height. We don't have really any really easy solution. So one of the ways to do this is to basically turn this into essentially a two column page. So we'd have another parent here that we would add, and then this would be a class of column 1 main. And what this would do is this would actually hold both those columns. So it would hold column 1 main and column 2. And then instead of floating column 2, let's just take this one out. And we would need to float this one over to the left-hand side. And we'll give the background color as well. So we're going to give the background the full color. We can also set height of 100%, but that's actually not going to really make much of a difference here with what we're doing. So the idea here is essentially to build a two-column site, a two-column layout, and then have that wrapped in another two-column layout. So we would have the two columns in one, floated to the left and floated to the left, and then we would have another column section over there. So this is where, again, things get kind of tricky here when we start doing this. So we need to do this, and this would be 66% because we're taking that full available spacing. So now we need to adjust these ones to be 50% because they're actually going to be 50% of whatever the available spacing is. And maybe this one actually has to be 67. So we do something like this where we've got the 67%, and then here is where we would take that background of red, refresh it, and so that way we can get that full width. So basically what we're doing is we're wrapping inside of another container, wrapping it, and then of course we can do the same thing for this main one. So we've got the main one has a color of green. So let me just check. So I know we've got a few nested into other ones. So we've got basically this background, this one here. So this would be our main one. So this one would actually have to have the green background. And refresh that. So that essentially gives us the three columns. They're all going down to the same height. And that's a quick fix. Of course, online there's a whole bunch of solutions to this, and this has always been a challenge when you're designing web pages in order to make, when you're creating these columned websites, that you have the ability to, if you do have a background color, for it to go all the way down to the bottom. So always been a challenge, and again, this is another way to do this, and there's a number of different ways that you can that you can accomplish this as well. So remember, again, you could work with as many columns as you want, and if you set the parent there and if you break out of the div, if you do the clear fix, then that will bring the whole column height all the way down to the bottom. So essentially that's what we've done here, and that's been our fix for getting the content heights aligning. And this is a 3-column website.